The darkness smelled of rust and damp. An Alabai, once called Alabaika, lay curled on the cold concrete floor, where a thin layer of straw had long ago turned to dust. The cage, 3 paces long and 2 wide, was her world. Steel bars, stained by time, separated her from everything that could be beyond. She didn't know what was out there. She couldn't remember. 4 years ago, as a puppy, she had arrived, a trembling ball of fluff with eyes full of curiosity. Now those eyes were dull, as if someone had snuffed out the light within. She was known as Alabai, but no one ever spoke her name. To the people who tossed a bowl of slop her way once a day, she was just the dog. Her coat, once a beautiful golden red, was matted with filth. Her tail, which as a puppy wagged like a little propeller, now lay pressed motionless against her body, as if afraid to draw attention. She'd learned to be invisible, to be silent when the owner's heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. His voice, sharp as a whip crack, made her heart seize up. Sometimes he'd yell, sometimes he'd kick the cage, and the bars would rattle. She would shrink into a corner, closing her eyes as if that could hide her from the world. Food didn't come every day. Sometimes it was a piece of stale bread, sometimes bones stripped clean. She learned to wait until the footsteps faded, until the man's scent was gone. Only then would she creep toward the bowl, sniffing it, checking for a new threat. The water was murky with an iridescent sheen, but she drank because there was no other choice. Her ribs protruded like the keys of an old piano, and each breath was a little heavier than the last. In 4 years, she had forgotten the feeling of grass beneath her paws. She'd forgotten the scent of the wind, forgotten what it was to run, to feel her muscles come alive and her heart beat in time with her steps. Her world had shrunk to the size of her cage, to the sound of dripping water in the corner, to the squeal of rusty hinges. When the owner opened the door to throw in her food, or worse, to hit her, she didn't know why. Maybe it was because her eyes still looked at him with a sliver of hope, even when she herself no longer believed in it. Sometimes, in rare moments of quiet, she would lift her head and look through the bars. Beyond the cage was the gloom of the barn, filled with old boxes and coated in dust. Occasionally, a ray of light would pierce through a crack in the roof, and Alabai would watch it as if it were alive. It would slide across the floor, touch her paws, and she would freeze, afraid to scare away the warmth. It was the only thing that reminded her of something more than the cage, something she couldn't remember but felt deep inside, where a tiny spark still glowed. At night, when the barn fell silent, she would close her eyes and dream. She'd dream of fields where she ran breathless with joy, where warm hands stroked her and a voice, soft as a whisper, called her name. But each time she tried to run toward that voice, the bars would rise before her, cold and impenetrable. She would wake with a start and find herself back here, in the cage, where not even dreams could save her. For years, thousands of days merged into one endless nightmare. She learned not to whine. It only angered the owner. She learned not to look him in the eye. It ignited his fury. She learned to be a shadow, to disappear into a corner where no one would notice her. But even shadows dream. Somewhere deep in her soul, beneath layers of fear and exhaustion, something alive still whispered, "You are more than this cage." She didn't know how much more she could take. Her body was failing, but her spirit, the one that made her follow the sunbeam, still clung to life. She didn't know that somewhere beyond the barn, beyond her world, people were gathering. People who had heard about her. People who couldn't sleep knowing she was here in this cage. People who were already on their way to give her what she didn't even dare to dream of. For now, Alabai lay pressed against the cold floor, her eyes following the thin strip of light from the crack. She didn't know this light was just the beginning, that soon, her small, terrifying world would be shattered not by blows, but by a kindness she hadn't yet learned to trust. The barn trembled with the sound of footsteps, not heavy like her owner's but hurried, unfamiliar. Alabai lifted her head, her ears twitching as she caught the whisper of voices breaking through the dusty gloom. They were soft but insistent, like the wind knocking on a closed door. She pressed herself against the back of the cage, her thin body tense, her heart pounding as if it wanted to escape her ribs. The voices grew closer, not one but several. A man, a woman, and another voice a little softer. Shoo! A near whisper. Alabai didn't understand the words, but she felt their tone. There was no anger, but there was a deep sadness. She recognized this sound. It's how people talk when they're looking for something lost. Through the gaps in the wooden wall, a beam from a flashlight cut through the darkness, gliding over her cage like a curious gaze. She squinted, instinctively tucking her head down. The light was too bright, too foreign. The barn door creaked open, and silhouettes appeared in the doorway. 3 of them. A woman with short hair and a bright vest, a man with a backpack full of tools, and a smaller figure with a notebook in their hands. They stopped, and silence hung in the air like dust. Alabai held her breath. Her eyes, shining in the dim light, followed their every move. "She's here," the woman said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and pity. "God, look at her. Just skin and bones." The man stepped closer, his boots scraping on the floor. He knelt before the cage, and Alabai saw his face, tired with lines around his eyes. But in those eyes there was something she didn't know. Not anger, not indifference, but something warm, like the sunbeam she used to watch. He reached a hand toward the bars, but he didn't hit or rattle them like the owner. He just held it there, looking at her. "Hey, little one," he said softly, his voice a gentle touch. "We're here for you. It's going to be okay." Alabai didn't move. Her paws were rooted to the ground, and the fur on her back stood on end. She didn't understand what they wanted, but she knew one thing. Humans meant danger. Humans meant yelling, hitting, and pain. Even this one with the soft voice was a human. She retreated until her back hit the cold metal. The corner of the cage was her refuge, the only place she could hide from the world. The woman in the vest knelt beside the man. Her hands trembled as she opened her backpack and took out something that smelled of meat. Alabai caught the scent, sharp, enticing, making her stomach clench with hunger. But she didn't move. Food could be a trap. She'd seen the owner throw pieces of bread to lure her closer before he would strike. The woman placed a piece of meat just outside the open door of the cage and retreated. "Come on, sweetie," she whispered. Her eyes gleamed as if with unshed tears. "You're free. Come to us." The word free meant nothing to Alabai. She knew the cage, its corners, its smells, its sounds. She knew where to hide when the owner was enraged. She knew how many steps it took to reach her bowl. But beyond the cage there was chaos. There was a world she didn't remember. A world that could be even worse. Her eyes darted from the meat to the people, from the people to the open door. She didn't move. The man sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he'd been carrying a heavy weight and only now felt its true burden. He turned to the woman. "She's afraid, Lena. She won't come out. But we can't leave her here." Lena's voice broke. She clenched her fists. "Look at her, Igor. She's dying. We have to take her." The third person, the one with the notebook, stepped forward. It was a young woman with a long braid over her shoulder. She crouched down next to the cage. Her movements were slow, almost silent. "Maybe she doesn't know what freedom is," she said quietly, her voice a rustle of leaves. "For her, this isn't rescue, it's the unknown." Igor nodded. His gaze returned to Alabai. She was staring at him, unblinking, her breathing fast and shallow. He'd seen that look before in other dogs, in other animals whose lives had been broken by humans. But something in her eyes, that mix of fear and a stubborn spark, made his heart ache. "We won't force her, Masha," he said, getting up. "But we're not leaving without her." Lena wiped away her tears. Her lips trembled, but she nodded. They began to work quickly, like people who had done this many times before. Igor took tools from his backpack to unbolt the cage from the floor. Lena and the young woman, Masha, helped, holding the bars as the bolts screeched in protest. Alabai watched, her body shaking, but she didn't make a sound. She didn't understand what was happening, but she felt her small world begin to sway. When the cage was finally pried from the floor, Igor and Lena carefully lifted it. Alabai pressed herself into the corner, her claws scraping against the concrete, as if clinging to something familiar. They carried the cage out of the barn, And for the first time in 4 years, she felt the air change. It was fresh, smelling of grass and dirt, but that only heightened her panic. She didn't know this world. She didn't want it. The cage was loaded into a van. The doors slammed shut, the engine rumbled, and the vehicle started to move. Alabai sat in her corner, her eyes gleaming in the dim light of the van. She heard the rescuers' voices, their whispers full of hope and pain. They thought they had saved her, but for Alabai, salvation was as terrifying as the cage. She closed her eyes, pressed against the cold metal, and thought, better the cage than the unknown. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the layer of fear, that same spark that made her follow the sunbeam whispered, what if they're different? She didn't believe it. Not yet. But the whisper stayed with her, a faint ray of light breaking through the darkness. The van rocked gently, each bump a reminder to Alabai's bones that her world was no longer standing still. She sat pressed into the corner of the cage, her eyes like two dark pools reflecting the faint light from a small window in the back of the van. The smell of gasoline and rubber mixed with something new. The scent of grass, earth, a life she didn't know. She didn't move. Only her ears twitched, catching snippets of voices from the front. Lena, Igor, and Masha spoke softly, but their words came through as a distant hum, full of anxiety and hope. Alabai didn't understand why they weren't yelling, or hitting the cage, or demanding something of her, as the owner had done. This scared her even more. The silence, devoid of threat, was alien, like the stars she hadn't seen in years. Lena sat in the passenger seat, her fingers nervously picking at the hem of her vest. She kept turning to look at the cage through the window connecting the cab to the cargo area. Her face, lit by the faint dashboard light, was tense. Her eyes gleamed with unshed tears. She couldn't forget Alabai's gaze, the look where fear was stronger than hunger, stronger than pain. Why didn't she come out? Lena whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. We opened the door. We called to her. She should have run to us, been happy, wagged her tail. Isn't that what all dogs want? Igor, gripping the steering wheel, glanced quickly in the rearview mirror. His face was grim, not from anger but from a pain he had seen far too often. Not all, Lena, he said quietly. She doesn't know what freedom is. For her, the cage is everything. It's her home, her safety. We are strangers to her. And the world beyond the bars is a chaos she doesn't understand. Masha, sitting next to Lena, was flipping through her notebook, but her fingers froze on a page. She looked up, her braids swaying slightly as the van turned. She's more afraid of being free than she is of the cage, she added, her voice soft but firm, as if trying to convince not only Lena but herself. 4 years, Igor. 4 years in that hell. She doesn't know that people can be good. To her, kindness is a trap. Lena clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to break something, to release the fury boiling inside her. Instead, she just exhaled, her breath trembling like a candle flame in a draft. How could someone do this? She asked, not expecting an answer. How can you keep a living creature in a cage like a thing? She doesn't even know what grass is. Igor, she doesn't know what it's like to run, to play, to be loved. Igor didn't answer right away. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his gaze fixed on the road. He had seen dozens of dogs like this, broken, forgotten, locked away. But Alabai was different. Her eyes, even full of fear, still held something alive, something that hadn't let her break completely. He didn't know how to explain it to Lena, but he felt it. This dog wasn't just another case. She was a challenge, a promise that even after 4 years of hell, there was a way back. We don't know what she's been through, he said at last. But she's alive. That's something. She hasn't given up, Lena, and we won't either. Alabai didn't hear their words, but she felt the change. The van stopped and the doors slammed again. She caught new sounds. Birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of other dogs. It was too much, too loud. Her heart beat faster, and she pressed herself even deeper into the corner, her claws scraping against the metal. The van door opened and light flooded in, blinding her. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling like a leaf in the wind. Igor and Lena carefully pulled out the cage. Their movements were slow, almost reverent. They set it on the grass and Alabai caught a new scent. Fresh, green, alive. She opened one eye, then the other and saw a world she didn't know. Grass swayed in the wind, trees stretched their branches toward the sky, and in the distance water gleamed in a pond surrounded by flowers. This was a shelter. A small oasis where rescued animals learned to live again. But for Alabai it wasn't salvation. It was a threat. Lena knelt before the cage, her face so close that Alabai could see every wrinkle, every trace of exhaustion and hope. "You're safe, sweetie," Lena said, her voice trembling but with a warmth Alabai had never known. "We will never hurt you." She reached out her hand not toward the cage, but toward a bowl of water she placed next to it. Alabai stared at the bowl, at the clear water reflecting the sky. She was thirsty. Her throat was parched but fear was stronger. She didn't move. Lena sighed, her shoulders slumping, but she didn't leave. She just sat there looking at Alabai, her eyes saying more than words. "I won't give up." Igor stood a little way off, arms crossed. He watched Lena, Alabai, and the cage that was still her prison even here under the open sky. He knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Alabai hadn't left the cage because she didn't know what freedom was. But he saw that spark in her eyes, that faint light that hadn't been extinguished even after 4 years. "She's not ready," he said quietly, addressing Masha, who was writing in her notebook. "But she will be. We'll give her time." Masha nodded, her braid swaying like a pendulum. She looked at Alabai, and a soft smile touched her lips. "She isn't just afraid," she said. "She doesn't believe. But we'll teach her. We'll show her the world can be different." Alabai didn't understand their words, but she felt their gazes. They didn't yell, they didn't hit, they didn't demand. They were just there. And it was strange, terrifying, but somewhere deep inside her heart, something stirred. That same spark that made her follow the sunbeam whispered, "What if they're right?" But fear was stronger. She closed her eyes and pressed herself against the cold metal of the cage, choosing the familiar hell over the unknown world. But even in that fear, in that refusal, there was something alive. She didn't know yet that it was hope, but it was already there in her heart, like a faint ray of light waiting for its moment. The grass under Alabai's cage whispered to the wind, swaying gently as if inviting her out. But she didn't move. The cage, still her prison, stood in the corner of a small room in the shelter, bright, with a clean-smelling wooden floor and windows that let in the golden morning light. This place was different. There was no rust, no damp, no owner's heavy footsteps. But for Alabai, none of that mattered. She only knew the cold of the metal, only the corner where she could hide. Her eyes, dark and wary, watched the world beyond the bars as if it could pounce at any moment. Lena sat on the floor a few feet from the cage, cross-legged. Her bright vest had been replaced by a soft sweater, but her gaze was the same, full of pain and stubborn hope. She came every day since Alabai had been brought here. Sometimes Igor or Masha were with her, sometimes other volunteers, but Lena was a constant, like the sun rising outside the window. She didn't try to open the cage again, didn't call to her, didn't reach out. She just sat, sometimes humming a quiet, almost inaudible tune, like a lullaby sung to a child afraid of the dark. "I know you don't trust me," Lena said one day, her voice soft as a feather's touch. "And I don't blame you. But I'll be here until you decide you're ready." Alabai didn't move. Her ears twitched, catching the sound, but she remained in her corner, pressed against the cold floor of the cage. The food Lena brought, pieces of boiled chicken, soft and smelling so good that Alabai's stomach clenched with hunger, lay untouched by the open door. The water in the bowl, clean without the iridescent sheen, reflected the light. But Alabai wouldn't approach it. She waited for Lena to leave, then she would creep to the bowl, but even then she ate quickly, furtively, ready to dart back at any moment. Igor came into the room, his steps slow so as not to startle her. He carried a blanket, soft, warm, smelling of lavender. He placed it next to the cage, not too close to frighten her, but close enough that she could feel its scent. She sniffed, her nose twitching, but she didn't move. Igor looked at Lena, his brows furrowed. "She's not eating," he said quietly. "If this continues, she won't make it." Lena nodded, her lips a thin line. She knew. The vet who had examined Alabai on the first day had been blunt. Emaciation, weakness, old injuries. Her body was hanging on by a thread. But her spirit, that spark burning in her eyes, still clung to life. Lena saw it, and it made her return day after day, hour after hour. "We can't force her," she said, her voice firm despite the tremble. "She has to want to herself. We have to give her a reason." Masha followed her in. Her braids swayed as she crouched next to Lena. In her hands, she held a bowl with something new. Pieces of apple mixed with honey. The scent was sweet, warm, and Alabai, despite her fear, lifted her head. Her nose twitched again, catching the aroma so unlike anything she had known. Masha placed the bowl a little closer to the door, but not too close, and retreated. Her eyes gleamed with contained excitement. "My grandma always said that honey heals not just the body but the soul," Masha said, her voice light as the wind. "Maybe this will help." Alabai looked at the bowl, her heart beating faster. She wanted it. She wanted the sweetness. She wanted the warmth the scent promised. But fear was stronger. She remembered how the owner would throw food to lure her, and then hit her. She remembered how every step toward the bowl could be her last. She turned away. Her eyes once again found the safety of the cage's corner. Lena didn't give up. She came every day, sat on the floor, and talked to Alabai, telling her about the world outside the window, about the grass, the wind, about the other dogs that now ran through the shelter yard, wagging their tails. She didn't expect an answer, didn't demand anything. She just was there. Her presence became part of Alabai's new world, as constant as the cage bars, but not cold warm like a sunbeam. One day, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, bathing the room in an orange glow, Lena brought a toy. A small rubber ball smelling of rubber and something alive. She placed it by the door and gently pushed it so it rolled inside the cage. Alabai flinched, her body tensing, but she didn't shrink back. The ball stopped a few inches from her paw, and she stared at it as if it were a living thing that might bite. Lena smiled, her eyes lighting up. "It's for you, sweetie," she said softly. "When you're ready, we can play." And Alabai didn't move, but her eyes never left the ball. Something stirred within her. Not fear, not hunger, but something else. Something she had forgotten over the past 4 years. Curiosity. She didn't touch the ball, but she didn't turn away. It was a beginning, a small, almost invisible, but a beginning nonetheless. Igor, standing by the door, noticed it. He said nothing, just gave Lena a slight nod. A faint smile touched her lips. They both knew Alabai wasn't ready to come out, but she was already looking beyond the cage. This wasn't a first step out of the cage, but a first step toward a home she didn't know yet, but one that was already waiting for her. Night fell on the shelter, blanketing it in silence. Alabai lay in her corner, but her eyes, shining in the darkness, were still fixed on the ball. She didn't know what it meant to play, to trust, to live. But deep down, beneath the layers of fear, that spark that made her follow the sunbeam whispered, "What if it's safe?" She didn't believe it, not yet, but the whisper grew a little louder, like a faint ray of light breaking through the darkness. A glimmer of hope. Morning at the shelter began with a soft light pouring through the windows, painting the wooden floor in warm, honeyed tones. Alabai lay in her corner, her eyes still wary, watching the sunbeams dance on the wall. The rubber ball Lena had left yesterday lay untouched, just a few inches from her paw. Bright and foreign, it was no longer as frightening. She didn't touch it, but her nose twitched a couple of times, catching its scent. Something about the ball, its stillness, its silent presence, was starting to feel less like a threat and more like a mystery. She didn't know it was curiosity, but it was already stirring in her heart like a weak sprout pushing through a crack in the pavement. Lena entered the room, her steps light and almost silent. She carried a food bowl with pieces of boiled chicken mixed with something new that smelled of creamy warmth, cottage cheese. Masha had suggested it, noting that Alabai was starting to react to new scents. Lena placed the bowl by the open door as always, not too close to scare her, and sat down on the floor, crossing her legs. Her sweater was the same soft one, smelling of lavender, and Alabai was beginning to recognize that scent as part of this new world, one that still scared her but not as much. "Good morning, sweetie," Lena said, her voice a soft, persistent whisper. "It's a beautiful day. The sun is shining, the birds are singing. Want me to tell you about the other dogs? They're out in the yard playing." She paused. "There's one, you know, whose tail wags like a propeller spinning non-stop." Alabai didn't move, but her ears perked up slightly, catching the sound. She didn't understand the words, but Lena's tone was as warm as the blanket Igor had left next to the cage. She was getting used to this voice, its rhythm, the way it filled the silence without demanding anything in return. Lena didn't move toward her, didn't reach out, didn't open the cage wider. She just was. And her presence became like a lighthouse in the fog for Alabai, distant but visible. Igor came in behind her, his face tired but his eyes burning with stubborn determination. He sat down next to Lena, holding a bottle of water and a bowl. He slowly poured the water, and its sound, clean and clear like a stream, made Alabai lift her head. She hadn't drunk anything all morning. Her throat was parched, and the sound was almost unbearable. Igor placed the bowl next to the food, a little closer to the door than usual, and fell silent. "She's looking," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "That's progress." Lena nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. She noticed how Alabai's eyes, still full of fear, lingered on the bowl for longer than before. She didn't crawl toward it, didn't take a step, but her gaze no longer darted back to the corner of the cage immediately. It was a small miracle, as fragile as the first snowfall, but it was real. Masha appeared in the doorway, her braids swaying as she entered, carrying something wrapped in cloth. It was a toy, a soft bone-shaped plushie that smelled of something warm like fresh bread. She placed it next to the ball inside the cage. Alabai flinched but didn't retreat. Her nose twitched again, catching the new scent, and she looked at the toy as if it were something alive that could move on its own. Masha smiled, her eyes lighting up. "My dog loves these," she said softly. "Someday you'll love to play too, Alabai. I know you will." Alabai didn't know what it meant to play. She didn't know what love was. But these people, their voices, their scents, their unwavering patience, were beginning to seep into her world like water seeping through cracks in a stone. She was still afraid, still waiting for a blow, a yell or pain, but none came. There were only them, Lena, Igor, Masha, and their quiet, stubborn belief that she would come out. An hour passed, then another. Lena sat, humming. Her voice was like a river, flowing slowly but surely. Alabai watched the bowl, the water, the toys. Her stomach growled, her throat burned, but fear still held her in the corner. Then at some point, as the sun rose higher, flooding the room with gold, she took a step. One small, almost imperceptible step. Her paw touched the floor of the cage, a little closer to the door than usual. She froze, her heart beating so loudly it seemed everyone in the silent room could hear it. Lena held her breath. Igor and Masha exchanged glances, their eyes shining. They didn't move or speak, afraid to startle the moment. Alabai looked at them. Her eyes met Lena's, and for a moment something shifted. It wasn't trust yet, but it was curiosity that had overpowered her fear. If only for a second. She crept closer. Her nose touched the water bowl and she took a sip. One quick gulp like a thief in the night. Then another. And then she took a piece of chicken, swallowing it without taking her eyes off Lena, ready to retreat at any second. Lena couldn't hold back her tears. They rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away, afraid to break the silence. Igor placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers trembling, but he didn't speak. Masha wrote something in her notebook, her hand shaking. It was a breakthrough. Not an escape from the cage, not a leap into freedom, but a step, small, fragile, yet so important. Alabai ate. She drank. She watched them, and in her gaze, still full of fear, a shadow of something new appeared. As evening fell, Lena stayed in the room alone. She sat, watching Alabai, who had returned to her corner, but no longer pressed herself so tightly against the bars. The ball and the bone-shaped toy lay nearby, and Alabai occasionally glanced at them as if asking, "What are you?" Lena smiled, her heart beating faster. "You did so well, sweetie," she whispered. "You took a step, and we'll take many more together." Alabai didn't respond, but her ears twitched, catching the sound. She didn't know what it meant to do well or to be with someone, but that one small step, that gulp of water, that piece of chicken was the beginning, the start of a journey she couldn't yet see but that was already leading her home. Deep down, the spark that made her follow the sunbeam whispered, "What if it's true?" She didn't believe it, not yet, but the whisper grew even louder, like a ray of light breaking through the darkness of her cage. A first step to freedom. The sun rose over the shelter, its rays breaking through the leaves to paint golden patterns on the grass. Alabai lay in her cage, but her corner was no longer so cramped, so hopeless. The door remained open, as it had for the past week. And although she still hadn't dared to leave, her gaze lingered more and more on the world beyond the bars. The room, filled with light, smelled of cleanliness and something new, freedom, which she didn't yet understand. Next to the cage lay the ball and the soft toy bone, no longer so foreign. Alabai would sometimes touch them with her nose, hesitantly, as if checking to see if they would disappear like the dreams of fields that came to her at night. Lena came in, as always, with a smile as soft as the morning light. Her sweater was new blue, with the scent of lavender that Alabai now recognized from a distance. In her hands, Lena carried a bowl, but this time it held something special. Pieces of meat mixed with warm porridge, steaming and smelling of a home Alabai had never known. She placed the bowl a little farther outside the cage, on the soft blanket Igor had brought a week ago. It was a challenge, but Lena didn't rush. She sat on the floor, crossed her legs, and began to hum the same lullaby that had become part of Alabai's world, like the rhythm of her own breath. "Baron was in the yard today," Lena said, her voice a warm, gentle whisper. "He's our big black dog. He loves chasing butterflies. You should see how he jumps, as if he's forgotten he weighs more than I do." Alabai lifted her head, her ears twitching. She didn't understand the words, but Lena's tone and calm confidence seeped into her heart like water slowly eroding a stone. Over the past weeks, she had learned to eat from the bowl even with Lena sitting nearby. She had learned to drink water without looking over her shoulder every second. And one day, when Masha forgot her notebook by the cage, Alabai nudged its leather cover with her nose, and it was her first fearless touch of something new. But to go out, to step beyond the bars into a world that was too big, too loud, that still seemed impossible. Igor followed Lena in, his steps as careful as ever. He brought something new, a soft fabric collar smelling of leather and something fresh, like grass after the rain. He didn't come close, just placed the collar next to the blanket and sat down by Lena. His eyes, tired but warm, watched Alabai, and they held the same stubborn hope that burned in Lena's. "She's not as scared anymore," he said quietly, almost a whisper. "See how she looks. She's thinking." Lena nodded, a smile touching her lips. She saw it. In Alabai's eyes, still full of a shadow of fear, something else now flickered. Curiosity, a hesitant, fragile but living desire. The bowl of porridge sat outside the cage and Alabai looked at it, her nose twitching, catching the scent. She took a step, then another. Her paws trembled, but she didn't stop. Her muzzle crossed the invisible boundary of the doorway, and she froze. Her heart was beating so loudly it seemed everyone in the room could hear it. Lena held her breath, her hands clenched into fists, but she didn't move. Igor placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers trembling slightly. Alabai took one more step. Her paws touched the blanket, soft, warm, so unlike the cold metal of the cage. She lowered her head, her nose touching the bowl, and she began to eat slowly, hesitantly, but without retreating. It was her first step outside the cage, her first step into the world she had been afraid of for 4 years. Lena couldn't hold back her tears. They rolled down her cheeks, but she just smiled. Her eyes shone like the sun outside the window. Igor squeezed her shoulder tighter, his lips quivering into a smile. They didn't say a word, afraid to startle the moment, fragile as the first leaf on a spring tree. Alabai ate. Her tail twitched slightly. Not a wag, but a hint of one, like a shadow of a movement she had forgotten. Masha entered the room, her braids swaying as she froze in the doorway, seeing Alabai outside the cage. Her eyes widened, and she covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a cry of joy. She walked slowly, her steps almost silent, and sat down next to Lena. In her hands was another toy, a small stuffed rabbit smelling of vanilla. She placed it next to the collar. Finishing her meal, Alabai looked at the rabbit, her nose twitched and she nudged it. For a moment her eyes, still wary, softened a little. "You did it, sweetie," Masha whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You came out. You did so well." Alabai didn't understand the words, but she felt their warmth. She returned to her cage, to her corner, but this time it wasn't an escape. She was just resting. Her body was still tense, but there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not curiosity, but something more. A hint of trust, faint as the morning fog but real. She looked at Lena, at Igor, at Masha. Her tail twitched a little more strongly than before. Days went by, and Alabai began to come out more often. First for food, then for water, then just to touch the blanket, soft and warm. One day she lay on it. Her body was still tense, but she didn't return to the cage right away. Lena sat nearby, humming, and for the first time in 4 years, Alabai closed her eyes, not from fear, but from something else, a peace she had never known. One morning as the sun flooded the shelter yard, Lena opened the room door and called to Alabai. She didn't pull her or force her, just stood at the threshold, her hand pointing to the grass, to the world that was waiting outside. Alabai looked at her. Her heart was beating fast, but she took a step, then another. And then her paws touched the grass, soft, alive, smelling of freedom. She froze, her eyes wide, and she inhaled as if for the first time in her life. The sun warmed her fur, the wind rustled her ears, and she felt something she had never known before. A shy but real joy. Lena dropped to her knees, her tears mixing with the grass, but she was laughing, her voice trembling with happiness. Igor and Masha stood nearby, their faces beaming. Alabai didn't run or jump, but she stood on the grass, and that was a victory. Her tail wagged once, then again. It was the first true wag. A weak but living spark kindling in her heart. She didn't immediately become a happy dog. She didn't rush to play with the others, but she began to trust Lena, Igor, Masha, and the world. Her cage still stood in the room, but now it was just a place, not a prison. Alabai learned to come out, to feel the grass, the sun, the wind. She learned to live again, one step at a time. And each step was a miracle that Lena, Igor, and Masha celebrated as their own. Deep within her, the spark that made her follow the sunbeam now burned brighter. Alabai didn't know yet that it was hope and love, but she felt it, like the warmth of the sun on her fur, like the softness of the grass under her paws. She was ready for a new life, and that life was already waiting with open arms.